Welcome to your first official set of ecology notes. I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to try not to read the screen to you. I do encourage you to pause this. You need to know everything highlighted in blue, and sometimes I will have notes and I will tell you to draw a picture. So please watch the whole presentation. Under 15 minutes, I promise. Here we go. Maybe. Okay, first goal is how is an ecosystem organized? You need to know the definition of ecology. Ecology is what is blue here, the study of an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is the interactions of everything around you. So an ecosystem includes living and non-living things that we study, and by studying that, we are studying ecology. So lots of words kind of for the same thing, but make sure you can define them. An ecosystem is made of non-living things and living things. If you are not living, it is an abiotic factor. The word bio means life. If you put the prefix a or an in front of anything, it automatically turns it into a negative. So biotic means living, so abiotic is not living. It's basically just chemicals and weather. Soil is a little bit of a gray area. Soil is not living because it's just chemicals. However, soil is full of bacteria and other tiny living organisms, so some people will lump soil in with biotic, but I think it's abiotic. So the opposite of abiotic will be biotic. That includes everything that is alive or was alive. So if you cut down a tree, it is not alive, but using that wood is still a biotic part of the environment. So it basically is that. It also includes relationships between living things. Keep in mind, viruses are not alive. So a virus would be an abiotic factor, and other disease agents would be living. So study this page, make sure you know those examples of biotic factors. I want you to draw this graph. See if you can answer the question. If we were in class, we would be talking about this. I'm going to trust that you will try to figure this out. The biotic and abiotic factors that are affecting this graph and what is being affected. And the answer, the abiotic factor is the temperature and is affecting the biotic process of glucose production. And we can read from the graph that at 30 degrees, there's the max amount of glucose being produced by this plant. So, got to be able to talk like a scientist in here. Hopefully that makes sense. Next thing, how are ecosystems organized? Again, if we were actually live in class, we would talk about this. You need to know the definitions of all of these levels. So one living thing is one organism. Put lots of those together and you can call it a species. Count the number of species, you can call it a population. Make sure you know the definition of a species. We'll get back to this at the end of the year again, but you can interbreed, and I should add to that, you can create a viable offspring. So you can make a baby with something else, and your baby could make a baby. So a donkey and a horse, is that how it goes, can breed, and they create a mule, and the mule cannot make babies because a donkey and a horse are not the same species. Okay, anyway, I fumbled through that, my bad. Okay, a community would be lots of populations together. So we are a population of humans in the classroom. If we count all the bacteria, funguses, maybe some rodents crawling around, that actually becomes our school community. If you lump in a community plus our surrounding abiotic environment, then you have an ecosystem. And if you look at all the ecosystems around, then you have a biosphere. So you need to know the definitions of all of these organization terms, and then you should be able to fit them into a flowchart like this if you know what they are. Okay, please know the difference between a habitat and a niche. I'm not going to drill you on this, but it's good to know. Your habitat is where you live, you inhabit something. Your niche is kind of like where do you niche in or where do you fit in? So what is your job? So your habitat is your home. Your niche is your role in your family. What do you do to contribute to your environment? Another way to think of it is your habitat is your address and your niche is your profession. Okay, I want you to understand that when we talk about competition, we're talking about within a species competing for resources. So when we are in this classroom, you would be competing with the other humans here for maybe available food or space. Maybe over a long amount of time, you would start competing for a mate. You might compete for other resources like some fresh air or whatever else you need. But when we talk about competition, we're talking about within a population. So there's lots of competition within populations, which ultimately leads to evolution. At the end of the school year, we're going to talk about evolution, so we'll come full circle, and I'll talk about how competition within a species helps that species to evolve. Because whoever's better here at competing for their mate, they will get to have babies and pass on their genes, and so the strongest survive. Okay, goal number 2. How does energy cycle through an ecosystem? This is super important. Everything in the world is about energy because everything is really about physics. So where does biological energy come from? It comes from, dun dun dun, dun, the sun, which means everything that you've ever eaten in your entire life and all of your ability to move and think and feel is because of the sun. How does that do it? We have organisms that we call producers because they produce our food. They are also called autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means eat. So they are self-feeders. Troph means to feed, sorry, not eat, kind of the same thing. So anything that does photosynthesis, which means it can take light energy and convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen, and then glucose is the food. You need to know everything on this slide. You also need to be able to recognize the chemical formula for photosynthesis, which is CO2, carbon dioxide, plus water yields, that's what that arrow means, oxygen, and this is the formula for glucose. So you will not have to write it down, but you'll need to be able to recognize it. All right, let's keep going here. If I'm going fast, just pause. Okay, so if you're not a producer, you are a consumer, meaning you don't produce food, but you consume food. So consumers include herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers. There are certain levels of consumers. The first level, which would only eat plants, are primary consumers. If you are called a secondary consumer, it's because you eat these guys. You may also eat plants, but that's it. You don't eat anything higher than a primary consumer. If I call you a tertiary consumer, it's because you eat secondary consumers. You may also eat primary consumers, and you may also eat plants. But in order to be called a tertiary consumer, you have to eat the level below you. We can go all the way up to quaternary. Usually food chains don't go that high because there's not enough energy to be passed along. But the ultimate top consumer would be called a predator. And decomposers kind of fit in anywhere along this chart because they break everything down to make nutrients for the producers to produce more food. Okay, so another way of looking at it, if you are not a self-feeder, you're not a plant, then you are an other feeder. The other word for that is heterotroph. The prefix hetero means other. Again, troph means to feed. So you feed on others. Know the definition of predator and what a predator and prey is. Please write that down. This should be in blue, but it's not. And herbivores only eat plants. You should know that. Carnivores only eat animals. Omnivores eat both. And scavengers break down organisms that are already dead. So they're kind of probably more like a carnivore, but they only eat dead things. And again, decomposers fit in everywhere on our food chain because they break everything that's dead down into nutrients that go back into the soil. That's things like funguses and bacteria. Okay, we need to know what a food chain is, which is one chain, like a chain link fence or a chain that you wear around your neck, that goes from a producer all the way up to a top consumer. And then we always go back through the decomposers and they put nutrients back in the soil. So know the definition of a food chain versus a food web. A food web shows those food chain and feeding relationships, but in a more complex and real life ecosystem scenario. Okay, if you were to draw a food web or a food chain, you need to understand trophic levels, what kind of consumer, and how much energy is being moved. So this is how that works. Please draw this triangle in your notes. This is a food pyramid or a feeding, which is trophic, a feeding pyramid. The very bottom, which shows the most abundance, are our producers. That is the first feeding level because they make their own food. Our second feeding level would be the things that eat plants or our primary consumer. Our third feeding level is actually a secondary consumer. So the producer is an autotroph. These two are heterotrophs, but this is the first feeding level because they make their own glucose. Here's the second feeding level. Here's the third feeding level. That third feeding level is a secondary consumer. So don't get confused there. Please understand that this triangle shows abundance. We have the most plants, second amount of those guys, less of these, and as you go up in the pyramid, you're going to get fewer and fewer of each type of consumer. Why, you're wondering? Well, I'll tell you. It's because of how energy flows through an ecosystem. If all of the energy comes from the sun, that means the grass or our autotrophs absorb all of the energy they possibly can. They're going to use up some of that energy for their own life, and if they get eaten, whatever eats the plants, only 10% of what the plant has eaten in his life moves on to the grasshopper. So if the plants take in 10,000 kilocalories worth of sunlight, they only, if when they get eaten, by the time they're eaten, this grasshopper gets 10% of the energy that that plant has taken in. The next level of the food chain gets 10% of what's below. So where does the other 90% go? It goes into this organism's life. So the frog eats the grasshopper. The frog only gets 100 calories from the grasshopper, even though the grasshopper in his lifetime has eaten 1,000 calories. Okay, this is just showing relative amounts. The grasshopper, or the frog, sorry, will have to eat lots of grasshoppers in order to survive, but he'll use a lot of the energy for his own life processes. And when the frog gets eaten by the snake, only 10% of what the frog has consumed gets to go up. So food chains are never very long because the higher up you go, the fewer calories there are left for that next level of consumer. So when you talk about abundance in an energy or food pyramid, there's always the most autotrophs. Primary consumers are the second abundant, secondary consumers are the third most abundant, and all the way up. Why is that important? Because we talk about a keystone species. A keystone species is the most important species in an ecosystem, which a lot of people think the most important would be the grass, which is true. We have to have producers. But one blade of grass isn't that important. One hawk could be super important. If we lost one blade of grass, there's lots of grass, so it's not going to affect the ecosystem a whole lot. You get rid of one hawk, and you're upsetting all of this flow of energy here, which affects populations and all these other things that we'll talk about later. So I want you to know that a keystone species is key, okay? Because they have a large effect on the environment related to their abundance. So sometimes a keystone species can be a plant. More often than not, they're a top consumer or that top predator because of their disproportionately large effect relative to how many there are. So think about that. I want you to understand it. You have an assignment now where you're going to create a food chain and try to identify this energy flow and feeding levels and a keystone species. So that is it for now. See you in class.